So today, as Mark said, this is the third of our occasional series on our 8 principles, and today's that 5th principle. We affirm and promote the right of conscience, the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. And this principle has its origins in the work of the 20th century influential Unitarian minister, the Reverend A. Powell Davies. He's the one who added the phrase, the democratic process of human relations, to in the original 6 principles that were adopted in 1961. There's been several reiterations, but that was the first mention of democracy. And to Davis, democracy is the social and political expression of a religious principle, that all human beings are kin and humankind a family. And I like the idea that for us, democracy has arisen out of relatedness, out of kinship. As we have a tradition of taking this 5th principle seriously, as you can see from our ancestors like Olympia Brown. We want each person to have a say in the choices we make collectively. And we also know that majority rule has its limitations, that we need more than 50% plus 1 to make a good decision. And the lived reality in most UU congregations, in boards and committees, is informal consensus. We make sure people agree with the decisions being made. If there are too many objections, we stop and check in. Adjustments may be made or a decision to wait. No one of us has all the answers or the truth. And so as we hear each other's concerns and ideas, we usually end up with a better decision. And this doesn't mean that one person can block the needs of the whole, but we try not to ignore them. It means decisions take longer in the end, but also they're stronger. Church moves at the speed of trust. And that's how good decisions happen, when people trust each other, when they know that they will be listened to, when they trust that what needs to be discussed will be discussed, and trust that the leaders have the interest of the whole paramount in their decision-making process. And this trust arises from relationships, from the time we use to check in, to check out, the time we spend socializing, that time we use to get to know each other. We build from conocimiento. It's a Colombia word which means to nurture connection by sharing knowledge of each other. Conocimiento creates connection. It's about finding common values, which leads to that stronger commitment to shared work. And I think congregations work best this way too. Nurturing connections by sharing knowledge of each other. And we talk together well, we practice democracy well when we develop what American educator Parker Palmer calls the 5 habits of the heart. The first is understanding that we're all in this together, that we are, in our UU terminology, part of the interdependent web of all existence. We must embrace the simple fact that we're dependent on and accountable to one another, and that includes the stranger. The second habit is to appreciate the value of the stranger, of the other. To remember and respect that we aren't all alike, and that we learn from people who are not like us. I had a professor who used to say that interfaith groups never succeeded until the faith leaders were willing to speak of the differences between them, because that's where the learning and the growth happened. And the third habit of the heart is that ability to hold tension in life-giving ways. Creating connection with others who are different involves tension. And we have to learn how to manage those contradictions creatively. The genius of the human heart lies in its capacity to use tensions to generate insight, energy, and new life. From those tensions and contradictions, from those differences, you can sit with them respectfully, remembering that we're all in this together. That's where growth and evolution happens. Palmer's 4th habit of the heart is to own our own voice and agency. We speak and act out from our own understanding of the truth. We value our voice and use it, just like Olympia did. Finally, the fifth habit is a capacity to create community. Without a community, who is there to hear our voice, to listen to us? Community helps us amplify our voices, and it helps our power to grow and increase. As Palmer says, we must all become gardeners of community if we want democracy to flourish. So these 5 habits of the heart help us be and live into those democratic principles. To know that we're all in this together, to appreciate the value of the other, to hold tension in life-giving ways, have a sense of your voice and agency, and finally, that capacity to create community. And he calls these habits of the heart, and I think that's important, because these aren't intellectual stances, but embodied abilities. You really have to feel that sense of value of another person, a stranger, in order to connect. And I think all of these habits of the heart reflect the values we aspire to as Unitarian Universalists. And they are growing in the soil of this community. And we just need to remember that and tend and care for them, keep them flourishing. Parker Palmer speaks of having that sense of your own voice and agency as a necessary part of democracy, knowing our own truths. And I think we say this in our principle as the right of conscience. Democracy, talking together, works best when we speak from that still small voice within, that sense of what is right and needed. Now, the right of conscience can be misused to push individual rights to the exclusion of all else. And we can see that happening in various places around the world, around vaccination policies, that sometimes we have to balance out that individual right with the collective good. And that's always the struggle and the tension. Conscience is knowing what's right for you and what is wrong for you. But it's not about imposing your right and wrong on others. We know that there are many truths, that each of us can only say what is true for us. To create our common truth, we have to talk together. And that common truth is not always a perfect fit for each of us. And so we understand that the collective good can sometimes outweigh the individual. And that's okay. That's part of being in community. That's part of being in larger collectives. But it's okay when it's not a part of a long-standing pattern of oppression. And I think the task of our time is to ensure that the collective good stops resting on the exploitation of Indigenous nations and people of color on the most vulnerable, people who haven't traditionally had any say at all in our democracy. Our conscience checks in, lets us know whether we're in alignment with our values and if we're treating ourselves and others with care. And this is just a small example. The other day I was leaving a building, and as I approached the doors, I saw there was an elderly woman begging for change on the right outside the doors. And so I turned left as soon as I got outside, and I didn't look at her. Now, I actually have had a personal policy pretty much since my early 20s that if I pass somebody begging for money and I have money in my pocket, I share. If I don't have money, I smile and I say sorry and take care, but I acknowledge them. But the appointment had taken longer than I expected, and I felt a bit in a hurry, and I was grumpy. And I remember just sort of having this thought flash through my head, I'm not in the mood. And not in the mood for what? To help a fellow human? To see somebody struggling? Someone who is like at the bottom and in such straits that they have to ask people for money. And I wish I could tell you that I turned around and gave her a $5 bill. But I have to say my grumpiness carried me into my car and I left. But my conscience told me clearly that I acted against my own values. And it bothered me, it has bothered me for days that I didn't help. Not because I believe the money would have been such a special moment for her, but also because I made myself less with that choice. I diminished my own sense of being, my own sense of self by acting against my conscience, because my conscience tells me that I have more than I need, and I help when people ask. And I think that's true for everybody. We live better when we're able to live listening to our conscience, when we listen to that still small voice within. One of the reasons I give to people struggling on the streets is because I feel their vulnerability. I know that I can hide my vulnerable self with money and words and comfort, but they're so exposed. Vulnerability is nothing but the underlying, ever-present and abiding undercurrent of our natural state. It's really the essence of our nature. We're vulnerable beings and vulnerable bodies subject to the forces of life and nature. We need constant watering and feeding. Our bodies age and stop working in all sorts of ways. And our spirits are vulnerable, tend to be wild animals that can shy away from exposure. Our hearts are vulnerable to pain and sorrow and suffering. We're vulnerable all the way through. And I think part of the human experience is learning how to live into that vulnerability. And part of that is living by our conscience, being willing to speak out, to name what we need, to name our struggles and sorrows, our hopes and our desires. And at the same time, we fear exposure and we try to protect ourselves from judgment. That's natural. Most of us know how to protect ourselves. We build that bright shell to present to the world. We speak around what we really mean. We let others speak for us. There's lots of options to keep ourselves hidden. Distance, disengaging, even turning to extreme or aggressive rhetoric. All of that helps us stay safe. And democracy doesn't work so well when people stand apart yelling at each other. It works when there's honesty and openness, when we acknowledge everybody's needs. American activist Adrienne Marie Brown says that in her social movement work, she asks herself, am I being as vulnerable as I need to be in order to keep growing as a human being and keep learning? Am I being vulnerable enough that people can experience my humanity? Now, these questions, I think, are for people who can hide their vulnerability, who can choose not to be vulnerable, not the people whose situations or experiences or identities mean that they are always vulnerable in some way. And I think it can sound a little strange to say that democracy rests on vulnerability, but I believe it does. I think it rests on the vulnerability of the privileged. It rests on those people talking together, sharing of ourselves, growing bonds that help everyone. It also rests on people knowing when the issue isn't about them, on being able to step back and listen to the people who are most impacted by a decision, who are most affected by what's going on. Conocimiento, that Colombia word, which means to nurture connection by sharing knowledge of each other. Conocimiento works when people are honest and vulnerable, even just a little bit, so that connections grow as common ground is found in our common humanity. Here at UCM, we attempt to create democracy out of building trust, each of us living by our own conscience, sharing vulnerability, talking together to find our common ground. My hope is that we continue to develop these healthy habits of the heart, that we continue to imperfectly and partially live our fifth principle, not just for us, but for those future generations. So say we all.